Hey, Peter.
Hey,
Define the word jazz.
you know what? Stop it.
Okay.
Just stop it.
Oh.
Stop trying to define jazz.
Okay. Define the word surly.
Me.
Oh, yeah.
That's jazz.
I'm Adam Manis.
And I'm Peter Martin.
And you're listening to the You'll Hear It podcast.
Jazz advice coming at you.
Oh, really? What's jazz advice, Peter? Define jazz advice.
Well, we're going to do, I just meant stop trying to define it until we get into the episode.
Oh, then we're going to define the hell out of it. Yeah?
Exactly. The name of this episode is Stop Trying to Define Jazz. So it was just, did I get a little surly, a little aggressive with you?
You got a little
Sorry about
aggressive.
that.
Yeah. It's a hot topic.
It is
right
a hot
now.
topic. Yeah. Well, we're going to embrace the discomfort. We're going to embrace the controversy. And we're going to try to define jazz, but we're trying to stop people from defining it while we define it.
Okay,
right?
so first of all, why would anybody want to stop defining anything? What's the problem with trying to define jazz?
Well, I don't think there's actually any problem with it. I think what we're talking about here is the concentration, this sort of fixation that we have within this genre called jazz, of saying this is jazz, this isn't, this is what makes it jazz, this is what doesn't.
Yeah.
And it seems to be a little bit outsized compared to other styles of music. You know, there seems to be a freedom in other genres to be able to either create something new and say, you know what, we're going to take several different parts of other genres and put them together and call it something that we've already created musically and then give it a title, as opposed to this sort of more exclusionary approach where we're like, okay, I'm the gatekeeper, or this organization is the gatekeeper, or this group of journalists, whatever it is. You have some kind of tribe that the jazz police, whatever it is, that says this is jazz, this isn't. I mean, what other genres do that actually?
Well, I think there's a few. I would say that, like, you know, a lot of folk genres do that. There's
Really?
gatekeeping and bluegrass and maybe classical music. There probably is a little bit too.
Mm-hmm.
I think probably the more specific you go, there's gatekeeping about what it is. But you know, this podcast, Peter, is all about helping musicians get better.
Yeah.
That's what our mission really is. Does that mean we're going to have fun around music and the culture and everything? But I always think of it as like, well, what good are these definitions doing, right?
Yes.
What purpose do they serve
Yeah.
to help, like, you know, you play better or enjoy the music more? And I don't think they really, you know, as you know, except for being able to search for things on, you know, streaming services and having subgenres, there seems to be a lot more energy spent on what we're calling some kinds of music than what the music is itself. Like there's the thing and there's the word for the thing.
Right.
And that's one too many things.
But words do
'cause
matter.
You can just have, well, words do matter, but why, you know me, I'm not a fan of labeling any kind of art or music because I think it doesn't serve, especially as the artist, it doesn't serve us at all. It kind of puts us into a box and this is what we should be doing. It gives us a list of shoulds. Here's what jazz should sound like, right?
But it's like, how do we agree with all that? But how do we find that place where a label or a tribe, an organization, a grouping, a coming together of people, a rallying around a certain sound or something? Like, how do we find that place where we define that enough so that people, not only listeners, know what they're getting, or at least the general tent that they're entering, but also the musicians kind of know what they're doing. Like they know, like, oh, I'm a guitar player, you're a piano player. What kind of music do you play? Like, should we be like, oh, I don't give it labels? You know, like there's going too far in that direction sometimes. But then there's also like, I'm a bluegrass, prog rock, you know, pianist only or something, you know. And it's like you can get too specific. So I guess what we're saying is stop trying to define jazz. Stop trying to use, like, what I don't think is always useful is to say, like, jazz is Miles Davis, or jazz is Louis Armstrong, or jazz is swing groove. Like, to take these specific elements that are certainly associated and may even be, in fact, dominant in the actual sort of manifestation of the music among the musicians and the listeners and the community. I think that's what's important. Like, how do we define the jazz musical community? What is the commonality as opposed to like trying to restrict it?
Yeah. So there are certainly sets of shared values in communities.
Shared values.
And he's writing. Look, he's writing down his bujo here. No, but that shared values is something that brings people together. But that's the thing, is when you say like, okay, well, all jazz musicians share, these same values. It's not all the same values, and then there are some that spill over. So, for instance, like, a lot of musicians who might play what people call jazz would also play.
Ooh, that's loaded words. You're saying people call jazz.
Well, that's because
you're saying it's not jazz.
Yeah, because I'm not. Well, yeah, I don't. But I don't think. I think it's a case by case basis, isn't it?
So
it's
give me your definition of jazz then.
I mean, it depends on what you're talking about. It really depends on who you're talking to.
Okay.
Because it can go we can get very scopy, right? So
well, I'm talking to you, buddy.
So to me, I would define jazz as music from very early in what most people would call jazz, right? I think there's all of these subgenres and growths out of what was jazz or called jazz. And I kind of am in the belief of the sort of Black American music diaspora of the whole thing. And that is a shared value system that is actually very easy to see and define. And once you understand that, I think it all gets very easy. The fact that anybody who plays what people would call straight ahead jazz could also probably play on a Motown album, could also probably play with, Stevie Wonder in the 70s, with Prince in the 80s, with Michael Jackson, like the shared value system of all of that coming together. That to me is easier to recognize being in it now for quite a while than here is jazz as this thing from 1920 to 2023, right? The shared value system of the Black American music diaspora, I think, is a lot easier to understand, because there's those values cross over from these arbitrary genres,
right?
Via musicians.
Yeah. That's a great thing. So then I would ask you, how big is your tent? Does it include, like you mentioned, Stevie Wonder? Is Stevie Wonder jazz?
No.
Is some of Stevie Wonder's music jazz?
No.
What if a jazz musician is playing Stevie Wonder's music?
But these are your definitions.
No,
Who's a jazz
I'm
musician? So Jeff Beck plays a solo on a Stevie Wonder album, and Tom Scott plays a solo on a Stevie Wonder album, and Herbie Hancock plays a solo on a Stevie Wonder album. I guess people would say that Herbie's a jazz musician, Tom Scott's maybe a smooth jazz musician, Jeff Beck is a rock guitarist. They're all kind of playing similarly. They're playing themselves, but they're in the same situation.
So they're not playing. That's not jazz at that moment.
No, I don't. But I don't think what Herbie's doing in the 60s and 70s is jazz either.
Really,
you're asking me my personal.
Yes.
So if I'm talking to my Aunt Linda, it's all jazz.
Shout out Aunt Linda.
No, but you know what I'm saying. It depends on who you're talking to.
Like if there's some people, it's like if there's no singing, it's jazz.
Right, we're in the weeds, but words are a form of communication, and all they need to be is effective that I'm communicating an idea. So if I'm talking to someone who's not musically inclined to like this kind of music or these artists that we're defining, I'm going to say, Stevie Wonder he's a pop artist, but he's got a jazz flair, right? And Herbie Hancock is definitely a jazz musician. If I'm talking to my Aunt Linda, who doesn't know anything about it, shout out Aunt Linda, she's a beautiful person, but not the most well versed on the subject we're talking about, right? But as a form of communication, I'm going to use the words that are going to help. In my own thinking about it, I'm not thinking about it like that at all. That's not how I define that music.
Right.
If I'm talking to you about it, we're going to talk into a different way. If we're talking to our listeners about it, of course, we're going to use the shorthand of jazz musicians, or this is modern jazz, or whatever. But words are just there to communicate. There is no, just like, this is an interesting topic, but there's no real proper word or English. There's no single authority that says this is what this word should mean. It's all, if it is effectively communicating, it works. If I ask you for a glass of water and you bring me a chicken, it doesn't work.
Right.
You know what I mean? If I say, check out this is jazz here, and you don't know, go put on some jazz, and you put on, Judas Priest, that is not working, right? So it's however we're communicating.
Right.
That's really, now we're in the weeds of the
but it's not
verbiage.
I think this is really useful, because there's, obviously I was pushing you towards, I was backing you into a corner a little bit, and I think you punched your way out pretty well there, because it comes back to, we can get into a thing of like, if everything is jazz, nothing is jazz.
Right. Exactly.
Like if we're like, oh, well, a jazz musician was in the building when that was recording, so that makes it jazz. Obviously, that's probably going like Judas Priest or whatever. But those are more like, I would put out there, and this was a little bit of a setup, full disclosure.
I know, man.
You know,
I know how you work.
No, because I heard something recently that really resonated with me, and since we're talking about defining jazz, it's something that I've deeply believed, and we've talked about it, and I've said before, but I thought coming from another perspective, I think is always interesting. So.
Totally.
Scott Devine from Scott's Bass Lessons has a wonderful podcast, the SBL podcast that I was recently listening to. Shout out Scott and Ian Martin Allison, who do the podcast, much as we do here. You'll hear it, just talking about music. But they're coming from a bass player's perspective, which is something that I didn't really understand until I started listening to that podcast. I mean, I understood, of course. We play with bass players. I even play a little bit of bass or whatever, but specifically electric bass players.
Look at you. Yeah.
I mean, a little bit.
Yeah.
But I think that they have such a healthier attitude sometimes.
Bass players? No. Come on. All right, we got to go.
I'm not a fan of
that attitude.
No, they have because they're more likely to be sort of genre bending in terms of like where
they got all the gigs, man. There's no bass players, so
they got to know all these different
know all
things.
the different things.
Yeah, so I think that their attitude towards like they're not as precious about jazz as something else.
I agree with that.
And they're also, but I mean, basically what Scott was saying on this podcast was when he was talking about jazz and the importance for electric bass players to learn jazz and how his whole thing was like kind of antithetical. What do you call that? Antithetical. Oh, he's looking it up.
I'm looking
Anti.
up something,
It's sort of against what we look at in jazz, because he was saying like, look, if you're a bass player, learn jazz, even if you don't like jazz or if you're not planning on playing it, because it's going to help you become a better bass player. And he got really into the weeds in terms of like bass lines and learning harmony and how like this is a great place. And this is something that's a little bit cringy, I think, for hardcore jazz players, where they're like, no, you come into our walled garden if you're ready to bow down at the altar of one of the greatest forms of music ever made, and some stuff that maybe is a little I bristle at.
You're like, oh, is that me?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
No, but this idea that jazz is inclusive of many different things. And so, a definition that I've always thought about, and I think I've said before, is like, and I want to just throw this out there. I'm going to dangle this and give it a floor and see what you say.
Okay.
Anything that is current and is improvised, like has improvisation as one of its main elements, its kind of core subjects, its core tenets, shared value, is jazz.
I would say that's anything that's current and has improvisation is jazz, is what you're saying.
Well, I would just say current because I believe strongly that jazz is something that's alive and still evolving and it's transitional, but it's happening now. That's just why I'm saying current. You can even take that out to say anything with improvisation, but then I know someone's gonna be like, oh yeah, well they improvise on Gregorian chants. Is that jazz?
Well, they do. Like klezmer music, bluegrass music, a lot of folk music, there's improvisation from all over. I think
a lot of that I would include as jazz.
I would not include bluegrass or klezmer music as some of it maybe
Victor
if it's
Wooten.
like.
What about Victor Wooten?
Yeah,
is he bluegrass or is he jazz or is he funk?
But now you're making my point of it's really an artist by artist version of a shared set of values, and there's something that's missing when you say Victor Wooten. You're also talking about again that Black American experience and coming out of a direct lineage from that line. And I think there, if you go to like, non-American klezmer musicians that have, training in improv, that has nothing to do with that line that leads to Stevie Wonder and Robert Glasper.
Okay,
and
so maybe
else.
there's some outliers a little bit, but I mean, if you're talking about the kind of core musical tenets that came out of the Black American music tradition,
would be
improvisation is one of the
them,
biggest ones.
But I think there are other ones as well that are crucial for how. Exactly, blues has got to be part of it. It's got to be part of that experience of
but
the music.
But that's part of a lot of the. Now, full disclosure, I'm not a bluegrass expert. No, that element is a big part of it.
For sure,
right?
For sure, because obviously in America everything is sort of happening and swirling around at the same time. People are swirling around at the same time.
But I'll give an example.
Influences are there.
Okay, this is a little bit before your time, maybe. But you remember Bela Fleck and the Flecktones?
Of course.
Okay, but you remember when they were like? I remember when I first went on the road and was like, doing jazz festivals and stuff. Like they were prominently featured on jazz festivals, and
of course,
very successfully. But there was some pushback during that time to be like, they're not really jazz. And I remember always being like, well, people are at a jazz festival and they're enjoying it and they're improvising a lot.
But
like they might not be swinging on every tune.
Is Fish jazz?
I don't really know their...
A lot of improvisation.
Yeah.
Like that's the core of what they're doing.
Jazz adjacent? perhaps.
So this is what I'm saying, but there are some
Aquitative
values
jazz?
that are shared, and I think not shared as far as what we're talking about here is what you would
Right.
define. And this is
But
why
they could be, what would you call Fish?
jam band,
Jam band. Okay.
which is
so
its own genre. It depends on who I'm talking
maybe
to.
they're a
again.
jazzy jam band. You know what I mean?
But all jam bands have on the spectrum of jazz influence. For
Well,
sure.
do you remember when they had the what were those groups? Like they were mostly out of the UK, like the what do they call it? It was some good stuff. Like I guess it was like Jamiroquai, that
Yeah,
kind of. That was
yeah,
like
yeah.
acid. They were calling it acid,
Acid jazz, yeah,
a
for
while.
sure.
But there was like
Very
acid
90s,
rock,
yeah.
and then something becomes acid jazz.
Yeah.
Like that. It doesn't also have to be like, for some reason in jazz, that's what we get. Like it's jazz. Like, and certainly people could say fusion or whatever. But like, why aren't we allowed to use jazz with other things? Why do the hardcore jazz people, the jazz police, have to say no? It's either jazz or it's not. Why can't it be acid jazz? Why can't it be third stream? Why can't it
Again,
be fusion, funk jazz,
so-
jazzy funk jazz?
for
Secrets.
a couple of things.
Pull you
so
back
first
in.
of all, as an artist,
Yeah.
labels aren't helpful as I'm trying to define myself. That's
But
not going to.
But well, hold up. Acid jazz, that was helpful. Hey, we're having a jazz festival. We got a couple of great new acid jazz. I'd rather know that than like we've got some straight ahead bebop
Again,
jazz.
because you're using the word to communicate something
Yeah.
to you. Again, if you're talking to your Aunt Linda, she hears Jamiroquai, she's like, "Oh, it's jazzy," you
Yeah.
know, and that's fine. And then we can talk about how that it's more of a big tent. But if I told you, "Hey, go put on some jazz," and you put on the Punch Brothers, I would be like, "What are you doing?" You know, that's not. That's not what I. If it depends on who you're communicating. I mean, if I'm talking to you, I'm saying go put on some Monk or go put on an artist that I
Yeah.
love specifically because I know who those people are. If I'm communicating to someone who's a little bit broader, I'm going to say go put on some bebop or go put on some straight ahead or go put on some Headhunters, style, whatever.
right, but it's straight ahead jazz.
Yes, that's what I'm
Smooth
saying.
jazz,
For
bebop
it's
jazz.
the scope. It depends who I'm talking to. If I know they know those genres, I can just say that. If I'm talking to someone who doesn't know all the genres, I'm going to say, I'm going to be very broad with how I'm talking about it. I'm not going to, if I want to hear the Punch Brothers, I'm not going to say go put on some jazz to someone who doesn't know that.
Right, but couldn't you say, I don't know about Punch Brothers
Or Fish. I'm not going to say, if I want to listen to Fish or the Grateful Dead, I'm not going to say go put on some jazz,
right?
or some bluegrass. Like
I know, but like Bela Fleck, Victor Wooten, that whole kind of sound, bluegrass. Didn't they even have a name for it, like blues?
Newgrass, maybe?
Yeah, I don't know.
I don't know.
That's something
No,
different.
something is-
But I mean, like bluegrass, jazz. I mean, like that definitely could have applied, and I'd be like, that's to me is under the jazz tent. Big Tent, baby.
For the
is
Big
what I'm
Tent,
saying.
yes. But I don't think none of this is very helpful because
So maybe this is why we should stop trying to define.
this is
jazz.
why labels suck. Labels suck because Bela Fleck is such an original voice and that band was such an original sound. They had the dude on the friggin' drum thing. That's
Right.
as
Future
a
Man.
Future Man. As original as it gets. Shout out
Right.
Nashville, Tennessee. As original as it gets, and we're trying to come up with some tent for it. It doesn't matter. Like
I'm not trying to come up with 10. I'm trying to say that is jazz.
Okay.
As
that's-
much as-
whatever you want to call it. The label is kind of meaningless. All it is a tool for communication. I don't know what you're kind of putting a moral system to it, but it's just a tool for communication. So a label is simply a word to describe something. So that's all we need to know about it. And it depends on who you're talking to. If you're talking to a bebop expert, you're not going to call Thelonious Monk bebop, probably. You're not going to call Herbie Hancock bebop. But if you're talking to, of someone who's not an expert, you might say, oh, it's all just jazz,
Well, but I agreed. But I do think that even for us more sophisticated artists, as we fashion ourselves, if there's a jazz festival going on and there's some acid jazz and there's some smooth jazz, some straight ahead, like I kind of want to know that. I don't need to, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like,
'cause you
maybe
wanna-
that's what I want to go hear. Maybe it's not.
If
But
you
it
don't know
doesn't-
the artist,
Yeah.
someone wants to communicate what you might be getting, what you might be in store for, that
Yeah.
can be helpful as a label. Yeah.
And what do you think about? But it's all. I guess my only thing I would get. So now I'm really sound like a Big Tent guy, which I guess I am. But I'm saying that the one dogma that I would, offer up as a possibility would be improvisation. So like if it doesn't have improvisation, is it really jazz?
No.
Or if it isn't improvisatory?
I agree with that. So
Like to me, that's the one
because that's one of
element.
the core tenets.
Yeah,
there's a few
yeah.
core tenets I would put swing and syncopation, not swing down, 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 but the sense of swing and syncopation and
Bop, shabam, shaboo,
no,
ba-doo,
no.
ba-doo, bow.
that rhythmic vocabulary is part of the lineage of the music.
Okay.
I think. I mean, that's why bluegrass isn't jazz, right? It's because it doesn't have the same rhythmic vocabulary.
Right.
I
Okay.
think.
kind of fixated on the bluegrass.
Well, because I think it's a great, it's actually a great thing that kind of runs parallel to what
I
we're
got
talking
one
about.
more
It's
for you.
American. It has improvisation. The structure is very similar as far as like how, the tunes go, but it's very obviously very different.
So what about your beloved record of Herbie Hancock, one of yours, Herbie
Yeah.
Hancock's Secrets,
Yes.
versus something he's doing right at the same time, kind of mid-70s, doing solo piano, so-called
VSOP or
yeah,
something
which
like
was
that.
shortly there, yeah. Or even just like when he's
Solo piano.
yeah, or the
standards,
duets he did with Chick or
Yeah.
whatever. Is that all jazz, or is everything but Secrets jazz?
None of it is jazz to me. To me, if you're talking about how I define it in my mind,
So wait, Herbie Hancock playing solo piano, footprints is not jazz.
not in my mind.
So what is jazz?
I
Louis
told you,
Armstrong and
it's
the
like
Hot Seven?
1920 to like 1940.
Really?
In my mind,
Kinda blue.
That sort of jazz age is yeah, I'm serious.
The jazz age, a lot of that music wasn't even jazz. That was
See,
just
I just don't agree. Like, but you're talking
kind
about
of blue. Is that jazz?
that's the beginning of the modal popularity of Miles's modal period. No, like you're talking about towards the way if I'm being totally honest, how I define this stuff in my mind, I don't like every artist that's defined as jazz. Even from the era that you would call straight ahead jazz or whatever, I have my favorites and I have people that I love. And in my own mind, I like music by artists. And that includes from around that same time period, people that aren't anywhere near the genre. This is just shit I like. You know what I mean? And so if I'm dealing with how I categorize it in my own mind, it's like, don't like. Like what I like to listen to, what I don't like to listen to.
But that's a different kind of labeling or classification. We're talking
I'm
about
not
genre.
I'm not concerned with genre when I'm in my own listening, though. Am I? Like, I'm not trying to, categorize things. It's literally just, and it could even be album to album. There are artists that I love.
Well, it doesn't
have
mean
albums that I don't like.
But why are you afraid to classify something as jazz?
I'm not
because
afraid.
it
It's
might
just
be something
not useful.
But I mean, it doesn't mean that you have to like anything that's being classified as jazz. Because are you a jazz musician?
No, I mean, do you think
Are
I
you
am?
a co-host of a jazz podcast?
I mean, listen, are we talking about if I'm defining myself to, our dear listeners?
Yeah.
I'm a jazz pianist. Yeah. Like that's easy to communicate. I can improvise. I know the language of the music. That's great. But if in my own mind, no.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. You'll hear it.
No. But it doesn't mean that you wouldn't define me as that. But like, I guess, again, it's the scope of who you're talking to. What are we trying to communicate and who are we trying to communicate? The way that I deal with organizing it in my own head, I don't limit myself to any genre.
Yeah.
I make the music I make, and it's pulled from, Def Leppard was my favorite band when I was 11, and that's part of my sound. Like,
Fun fact, up until I was about age 14, I thought the name of the band was Death Leopard.
it could be, but they're way too poppy. But like, I'm serious.
Yeah.
Like Prince is a huge part of my sound. Stevie Wonder's a huge part of the music that's just coming out of me, right?
Yeah.
As is like Soundgarden from when I was a teenager. Huge influence in how I view the world because I was a 14-year-old kid who loved that music. Like Dr. Dre, like all that stuff that was like popular when I was a teenager still has resonance with me, as well as the art music that I got into later, French composers and things like that.
But the fact that you took all these different influences and things that you loved and then kind of distilled them under what I would portray as the big tent of jazz music, like it's like that's sort of your chosen genre, whether you're willing to acknowledge it or not.
It's a huge part of my life. Yeah.
But you've taken all these different elements. I think that doesn't mean that what you've brought them together in your music and the way that you play and what your speciality is in terms of performing and teaching and understanding the lineage of it, that doesn't diminish any of that. What I'm saying is perhaps by a more inclusive, common element of improvisation being sort of the basis for how we define this music, that can bring in a lot of elements. Yes, there's going to be stuff around the edges where like, well, is that jazz or not? They improvise. But I mean, in terms of like, how do we understand what it is? Because what is it that most people use for jazz? It's either like the way that it looks or the way, whether or not it has a swing beat, like the people, the powers that be.
It's kind of blue, yeah.
That have a chance to say this is jazz, like what they would put up. A lot of times it's funny, improvisation is definitely talked about and people know, you're improvising. But like that's not really usually the stylistic element that most people use
No.
to sort of typify what the music is.
They do the cultural something usually from the late 50s
Right,
or
right.
early 50s.
But I find that a lot of the stuff that I'm really interested in, especially the stuff that's a little bit around the fringes and edges, has that improvisatory
Totally.
element
Yeah,
to it.
it's got to
So
be part of it.
It's just one way. But I guess we should follow what we're saying. Stop trying to define jazz. But if we are, let's define it as improvised.
I love the title of the episode is "Stop Trying to Define Jazz," and all you're doing is making the case for definitions and bringing more people into the definition.
Exactly.
I'm not against defining again
Because the label's going to be there whether we like
the
it or
label
not.
is there and it can be very helpful depending on the situation. Again, for Aunt Linda's of the world, and you want to try to talk about it, there's no use in trying to be like, well, actually,
Right.
Post 1945. Like, there's no reason to do that when you're just trying to casually describe something to someone. But when you're asking me about how I feel internally, I've done, a ton of work to really try to break down a lot of labels for my own artistry, so that like, my band, the 442s, which I'm so proud of, and I love playing with those guys so much. I really don't want to have any expectations.
That's a jazz band. That's a shoot bop doop bop
is,
scoob doop.
you know for sure that's not.
No,
but we
but
can
that's
play with
an
jazz
improvise-
musicians.
but think about
We got
this.
you, we got Peter Schlam, we got all these jazz musicians that come around and play with us.
But even if they're not jazz musicians, there's kind of a requirement, not a requirement. Well, no,
There's improvisation.
There's a musical requirement for everybody to improvise in that group, which makes it, to me, under that jazz big tent.
I wouldn't call it jazz, but yes, I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
If I
Connective
said
tissue.
but that's because of the music that I like. So again,
Yeah, 'cause
we're chasing our tails a little bit.
We
here,
are
I think.
chasing. Well, if nobody's listening.
We're 26 minutes in. Nobody cares. And nobody cared after minute 8. So thank you. If you are still listening, put Big Tent in the comments. This is the
If
gala.
you're on Team Peter, put Big Tent. Right? Wait, is that you?
No, if you're on Team Peter, Big Tent. If you're on Team Adam, I don't know what the difference is.
tent.
What
No tent.
Well, hold on. Before we
But
define,
tents are useful,
Where
'cause
we,
they're
where we,
shelters from-
where is the difference between what you were saying and what I'm saying? I can't really find the chasm here.
So what I'm saying, and I don't know that there's any difference, is that jazz is best if it has to be defined, which I think we've agreed, at least at times.
It can be helpful.
And Linda and beyond.
Yeah.
But if it's going to be defined, and I would actually say it's really important for it to be defined.
Okay.
Because people are going to use it. And if we don't define it.
Humans love little boxes. That's
Right.
indisputable.
Right.
Yeah.
So, think about like the NFL, American football. Like, they do a great job of defining. They actually took another word and redefined it for themselves.
We love doing
and
that
then
here.
they protect it legally, antitrust and all that.
Yeah.
But one thing is, if you're going to a football game in the U.S., you know what you're getting. If you go to a football game anywhere else in the world, you're actually getting football.
Yeah.
But I'm saying, so
A foot kicking a ball. Yeah.
So it would behoove us, I think, in the jazz world to define it, maybe not in terms of like in a dogmatic way, but for me, if it's going to be a little bit dogmatic, I would say, and if you want to be on Team Big Tent, what I'm saying, it's more team improv. How about team improv?
I don't disagree with you that improv is one of several core shared ideals that
Yes.
need to be a part of it, but it's only one.
I agree.
Okay.
Agreed. Gala. That's all I got to say.
Gala.
Yeah.
We're a little bit late to this. I just want to put a button on this.
I mean, ending this episode.
This is ridiculous, man. But to put a button on this, another reason why I'm hesitant to put the label jazz at all is I hate that word so much. It's a terrible word. It's like, just in general, I don't like
It's a discussion for another episode.
the aesthetic of the word.
Right.
And then not to mention the meaning, not to mention so many of my favorite
jazz?
artists abhorred the word. How about jazz? Like the etymology of the word, where it comes from, is kind of disgusting and cartoonish, and the whole
but most
thing.
people don't actually know that.
They don't know that, but I know that, and so
most fans of this music, we just call it this music. You can, call it tortoise. You can call it whatever you want.
Yeah.
But most fans of this music don't know and don't care about that.
Let's
be honest.
Go to openstudiojazz.com
That's
for a deeper dive on all this.
right. Thanks, Adam. Man, I kind of came at you hard today, and
I came back
You're
hard.
still
No.
smiling, and you might punch me like the
it's
punch brother.
I feel
No,
like
but I
we're
appreciate it.
closer than we are far away. It's just how do you want to define it in your again? It's a scope issue.
Improv. That's how I want to define
All right,
it.
we got it.
You'll hear it.